For a look at wages around the world and this issue and many others related, I'm joined by Rovert Reich, Chancellor Professor of Public Policy, UC Berkeley, and former U.S. Secretary of Labor, and author of many, many books, including a film called Inequality for All. Good to have you back on the show, Professor. Great to see you. This is a topic that has been discussed for probably at least a decade and a half. I remember back in 1999 when we had the WTO riots in Seattle, a lot of people said these trade rules would raise living standards in our partners, those with factories. My question is, did it?
Well, undoubtedly, international trade tends to benefit all sides because everybody comes out ahead. But that is partly theoretical. That is, the winners from trade come out so far ahead they could compensate the losers, that is, people who are losing their jobs, factory workers who are displaced, people who have to take new jobs that pay less. But in fact, that kind of compensation rarely takes place. And what we've seen, particularly in rich countries, in industrialized nations, is that there is a widening gap between the rich and everybody else. Not just because of trade, mind you, but also because of technological changes.
I went to visit a factory in Vietnam several years ago, walking by rows of places where they were building the shoes. Thousands and thousands of workers crammed in a very small place. And I asked the question, are they happy here? Lines out the door, people applying for those positions that we would say, hey, this is an outrageous situation, but these workers want to work in those, not necessarily situation, but in that environment. What responsibility do multinational firms like Nike and many others have in terms of ensuring there's a sort of global stability in that area?
Well, there should be at least global minimum standards. Now, obviously, very poor nations cannot afford exactly the same level of worker safety and support and worker standards that very rich nations can afford. But nevertheless, there ought to be at least a minimum of international cooperation and understanding that you're not good. Slave labor, forced labor is out. Unsafe working conditions, the employment of very young children under 12 years old, that there ought to be minimum standards of decency. And rich nations and developing nations should not be trading, indeed signing any trade agreements or enforcing any trade agreements with each other unless these minimum standards are achieved.
You know, when we see the headlines, when there's a factory fire or something tragic that happens in a factory overseas, the media, of course, rushes to cover the issue, but then afterwards, it kind of disappears. And a lot of people will ask, does the public really care about some of these issues? And if they did, why wouldn't they demand that the companies who sell these products perhaps have a better standard in place?
Well, the public gets very concerned. I mean, if you're talking about the public in the United States or in rich countries that are recipients of goods made in sometimes inhumane circumstances or very unsafe circumstances, yes, the public gets very concerned. Customers get very concerned. Momentarily, they put pressure on some big manufacturers and big retailers. But once the media glaze is over, once the intensity of the outrage has passed, people tend to get on with business as usual. They want the best deals they can get. And with the holidays coming, a lot of American consumers, for example, are looking for bargains. They don't completely understand, or they don't focus on the fact that bargains sometimes come at the expense of basic human rights in terms of safety and a decent place to live and decent wages.
Unfortunately, we want products for the cheapest price possible. It's just a fact of life here in the Western world. In fact, not all over the world. So whose responsibility is it then? Politicians seem to sort of shy away from this issue unless the cameras are on them, and you look at these trade deals and it's very rarely discussed. Why is that?
Well, I think it's everybody's responsibility. Individual consumers, I don't think, can be expected to sacrifice deals when they don't know that other consumers are making similar sacrifices. I mean, why should they sacrifice good deals? I think that there have to be, and it has to be enforced by governments. There has to be pressure on both major retailers and also major manufacturers to police their supply chains so that, for example, a major company like Walmart in the United States that is selling goods made in factories that have been unsafe or where there have been violations of basic human rights, those companies should be obligated to set up supply chains. The Labor Department, where I was once Secretary of Labor, should be enforcing the certain provisions of the law that make it impossible for those manufacturers and those retailers to get goods that have been made in violation of international law.
And then it gets into the tricky issue of enforcement, but that will be for another time. Professor and author Rovert Reich, thank you very much. Always good to have you on. Please keep up the good work in building awareness on this issue.